When temperatures reach 85 to 90 degrees for several days, tomatoes have a hard time setting fruit. But there are several things that you can do to help keep your tomato production up. In this video, I'll explain why you may not get tomatoes to set or ripen, and I'll go over the best practices and growing tips to help you get an excellent yield and help prevent pests and disease this summer. High temperatures, especially above 85 or 90 degrees, can cause tomato plants stress, interfering with the pollination process, causing the tomato blossoms to drop. Excessive heat can interfere with pollen viability and reduce flower production. The heat can cause pollen to get sticky, and hot weather can increase the rate of transpiration and the loss of water in tomato plants. If there is a water deficit in the soil, or if the plants are not adequately hydrated, blossoms can drop as a response to moisture stress. When the temperatures are on the rise, you can help your plants by cooling the area with shade cloth. 15 to 50% works well on helping cool your tomato plants. It'll all depend on your temperatures. It works much like a shade tree does for us. There are a few choices to help shade your tomato plants. A floating row cover of 15% can be placed right over tomato cages or trellises to completely cover the tomato plants, leaving it on throughout the heat of the summer, day in and day out. You can also create some sort of a structure that's tall to put your shade cloth over. This was our high tunnel. We took the poly off of it and put shade cloth over the top of it. The shade cloth covers the entire top and it goes down further on the south side. That gives us more shade because that's our sunniest spot. It's open on the east side, allowing for morning sun, and open on the west side, allowing that late afternoon sun. Whether you're using a floating row cover or a shade cloth, that can bring your temperatures down 5 to 10 degrees, and that's huge when it's hot outside. Of course, tomatoes need sunshine, but too much in a hot climate is too much. Tomato flowers are complete. That just means that they have both male and female parts, making them self-fertile. A gentle breeze is all you need for pollination, but insects can even help with the pollination and cross-pollination for your tomatoes. If there happens to be no breeze or a little insect activity, then you can give your little flowers and plants a shake, and that'll help with the pollination process, but more than likely you won't need to. The next phase after fruit set, of course, is sizing up or the growing of the fruit. And again, when the temperatures are high, this slows up the sizing up and the growing of the fruit. It typically takes 40 to 50 days for tomatoes to ripen. When the plant is stressed by heat, they go into survival mode, and the fruit on the tomato vine slows up. They still grow, but it's much slower. The last stage is the ripening stage, which is called the green mature stage. When temperatures are above 85 degrees, tomatoes do not produce lycopene and carotene, which are the pigments responsible for ripe tomatoes' color. So when temperatures are above 85 degrees for extended periods, tomatoes can stop ripening. So you can see that the heat not only stops the blossoms from setting, but also the growing and the ripening process. Shade cloth can make a big difference for dry, hot climates. Keeping the soil evenly moist is also a big component in keeping your tomatoes production up. I use a drip tape to water my garden. This system is great because it waters the garden slowly and deeply. This is perfect for tomatoes because it gives them a deep root system. When tomato plants dry out, the first place that they're going to start drying out is right at the tips, right where the blossoms are at. When you keep moisture levels up, then the chances of them dropping their blossoms lessens, and the plant is less stressed out as well. The same is true for overly wet soils. If the soil stays soggy for too long, then the plant's root system can't get oxygen. And if they can't get oxygen, the plant starts to decline and be more susceptible to disease. Problems can also come from irregular watering, like blossom end rot and cracking of the fruit. If you let your soil dry out for several days and then you give it a big boost of water, all of that water is going to rush through that vine and into that tomato plant that's ripening and cause it to burst and split. That same thing can cause blossom end rot, which is a brown patch that's on the bottom end or the blossom end of your tomato. Blossom end rot is caused by the inability to uptake calcium when the soil is too dry. Most soils have sufficient calcium in them. The key is to keep that soil consistently moist. Mulching is essential to help hold moisture into the soil and help keep the tomatoes' roots cool. It cuts back on watering by shading the soil, and it reduces weeds. Mulch is extremely important. The mulches that I like to use for my tomato plants are dry grass clippings from our herbicide-free lawn, hay stubble from the barnyard, pine needles, and even rough compost. When growing tomatoes in containers, you want to make sure that they have adequate water all the time, especially in those hot climates. You may find that you have to water a couple times a day to keep them moist. And if you're using a dripper, make sure that dripper is in the middle, because if it's off to the side, one side will be moist and the other side will dry out, just causing you more problems. If your tomato leaves happen to start to curl up and curl in, this isn't necessarily a sign of disease. This can just be stress from the heat. This is the way that the plant copes with the stress of heat. It curls in to try to hold in some of that moisture. If the overall health of the plant looks good and it's still growing, more than likely that's all it is, and it's not a disease. When it comes to pruning tomatoes, it really doesn't matter whether you prune or don't prune. You'll still get tomatoes. Pruning tomato plants is when you leave a few main leaders and remove all of the suckers. The suckers are what grows between a main leader and the leaf mode. I grow a lot of my tomatoes up cattle panels, and I'll prune them to 2 main leaders. By doing this, I can plant them a lot closer together, which gives me a bigger variety. Also, pruning is going to create more airflow, which really helps prevent disease. I can also get a bigger variety of different types of tomatoes in a smaller amount of space. With pruning, you usually get bigger tomatoes, but less tomatoes, because you're removing a lot of those suckers, and those suckers can be potential fruit. With heavy pruning, you have to be careful in hot climates, because you're exposing the fruit to the sunshine, which can create sun scald. So this is where your shade cloth comes in really handy and prevents that. Pruning also makes it really easy to find your tomatoes. When you don't prune, you do get more tomatoes. Generally they're smaller, but it takes less time to manage. However, I do prune to keep the foliage 1 foot off the ground. Tomato plants will naturally lose their leaves or have their leaves turn yellow or even brown and die on the lower parts of the tomato plant. This is totally normal as long as it's the lower part and not the entire plant. As your tomato plant starts to get older and bigger, it shades those lower leaves, just causing that dieback, which is totally natural. Don't stress over it, just remove those lower leaves. Early blight is a disease that plagues tomatoes early on. By pruning those leaves 1 foot off of the ground and heavily mulching can really help reduce the chance of getting early blight by preventing splashback from overhead watering or rains. You can also use a horsetail tea to help prevent early blight, and it also works as a light fertilizer as well. You can use fresh horsetail or even powdered or dry horsetail to make your tea. Make it just like you would a tea for yourself, dilute it and spray it over your entire plant. I like to feed my tomato plants a liquid bloom fertilizer or even a compost tea when they seem to start to lose their vigor. You can use your diluted fertilizer or compost tea as a root drench right around the base of the tomatoes, or you can spray it all over the tomato plants. You can do this as much as once a week. Stay away from high nitrogen fertilizer because it can inhibit the uptake of nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, which is all important for flowering and fruit development. High nitrogen fertilizer can also increase green lush growth at the expense of fruit set. Overhead watering is fine to do once in a while in the early mornings, but if you live in a high humid area, then I wouldn't suggest doing so. But the desert is dry and plants get dusty and they enjoy a bath once in a while. This also helps to keep the spider mites down because they love to live in dry, hot environments. Other pests like the tomato hornworm can wreak havoc very quickly on your tomato plants, and they can spread disease. If it looks like the tips of your tomato plants have been nipped off, you might have a tomato worm, and you can easily find them when you find their black droppings. If you can't find them or you have a lot, you can use a BT spray or a spinosad. Both these are great for organic gardens. But these should always be sprayed in the evening when the bees aren't active. Some excellent companion plants to help deter pests are nasturtiums, marigolds, and borage. I hope that these tomato tips help you with a successful tomato growing season this year, and may God bless you.